Most of us know about Isambard Kingdom Brunel, but today we're going to be looking at the other members of his family. So we'll start with the family tree, if I can get this to work. We'll start with the family tree. So here's Isambard Brunel with a little hat, but we're going to start right up here at the top left with his grandparents, Jean and Maria. They were French farmers, and they lived in Normandy, up here between Rouen and Paris, in a village called Hackville. And their farmhouse is still there today. You can go and have a look at it on Google Maps. And now the great thing about living in France is if you become famous, they name a street after you. So this house is now in the Rue de Marc Isambard Brunel. So this, of course, is Jean and Maria's second son and the father of Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Now, Marc was going to become one of the world's greatest engineers, and many would say a greater engineer than his even better known son, Isambard. Marc led an absolutely extraordinary life. It really ought to be turned into a film. He was the second son, and the family tradition was that the first son would run the farm and the second son would enter the church. But young Marc was far more interested in all sort of things mechanical, and he used to bunk off his lessons and spend time at the local wheelwright. So at the age of 11, he decided that he wanted to become an engineer. Despite this, his parents sent him off to a seminary at Rouen to train to be a priest. At the seminary, they realized that although this was a very capable young man, his future was certainly not going to be in the church. Now, by now, Marc had started to learn carpentry, and one day he needed a new carpentry tool. So apparently he pawned his priest's hat in order to pay for it. And when his parents found out, this really was the last straw. So Marc, aged 13, in some disgrace, was sent away to live with his cousin and her husband, Francois Carpentier, and they lived in Rouen. Dulage, who was a professor at the Rouen Royal College, and he became Marc's new tutor. Marc did really well with him. Dulage was quite influential, and he published this book here, which was the standard text used by the French Navy for teaching navigation. And so he had a bit of influence with the Navy, and through this, Marc joined the Navy as a cadet. He then spent 6 years afloat, mainly in the Caribbean, paid off from the Navy in 1792, returned to France just in time for the French Revolution. Now, Marc was very much a royalist, which probably wasn't a very good thing to be at that time. And when visiting Paris in 1793, he made a big mistake of predicting in public the downfall of this chap, Robespierre. And this triggered a small riot. Marc escaped by the skin of his teeth, fled from Paris, went back to Rouen and back to his cousin, the Carpentiers. And when he arrived, he found they had another guest, who was this lady, 17-year-old English woman, Sophia Kingdom, the daughter of William Kingdom, who was a Navy contractor at Plymouth. And she'd come over to France to learn French, but she'd fallen ill and was unable to return to England. And that was a bit of a pickle, really, because at that time it was becoming increasingly dangerous to be an English woman in France. And Marc, of course, was in a pickle because he was on the run and in danger of his life. So we got these two young people thrown together in a perilous situation, just like something straight out of Mills and Boon or a Hollywood movie plot. And of course, inevitably, they fell in love. But it was clear that Marc couldn't stay in Rouen, and he had to get out of France pretty quick. He managed to get a passport for America, and he set off on horseback to catch a ship at Le Havre. But on the way, disaster struck, his horse stumbles, Marc's thrown off, he falls unconscious, and when he wakes up, not only is his horse gone, but also all his papers and his passport. Fortunately, at that moment, a passing coach stopped, containing this chap, Gaspard Monge, who was eminent mathematician and also very high up in the revolutionary government. He was the Navy minister. And he was also on his way to Le Havre as well. And he gave Marc a lift, which was great because whenever they got stopped, Marc didn't have to produce any papers, which is just as well, of course, because he didn't have any. So he managed to get to Le Havre, got on his ship, but he still wasn't safe because the ship was intercepted by a French patrol frigate. Mark just had enough time to forge a complete new set of papers before the boarding party came on board, which were good enough to pass inspection, and he eventually arrived in New York in 1793. Once in America, Mark built up quite a reputation as a surveyor and a civil engineer. He even entered a design for the competition for the new Capitol building in Washington. This is his design. Quite well received apparently, but thrown out on the grounds that it was too expensive. But what it did do was raise his profile, got him more work. He became an American citizen and eventually chief engineer in New York. Back in France, things not going very well. The terror had started and a decree was issued ordering the arrest of all English nationals, and Sophia ended up in a convent at Gravelines on the coast, effectively imprisoned. The convent soon filled up with prisoners, so to deal with it, they set up a guillotine so they could make some space for some new arrivals. So it really wasn't looking very good. But just in the nick of time, in July of 1794, Robespierre fell out of favour. He got arrested and he was the one that ended up on the guillotine. The prisoners in the convent were all released, including Sophia, and she went back to England the following year. Meanwhile, back in New York, Mark became a friend of this chap here, Alexander Hamilton. Very big cheese in America, founding father of the United States, honourable, intelligent, influential, a really good and useful friend. Also, incidentally, the subject of a recent Broadway musical. So one evening in the first half of 1798, at a dinner party thrown by Hamilton, Mark heard about the problems the British Navy were having with the supply of pulley blocks, these things. The Royal Navy required 100,000 of these a year. It took, they needed about 1,000 for one 74-gun ship of the line. So Mark was intrigued and started to consider how the block making process could be mechanized. And although he didn't realize it at the time, he was contemplating what would become one of the world's first mass production systems. Hamilton encouraged Brunel and even gave him a letter of introduction to Lord Spencer, the British Navy Minister. And so in February of 1799, Mark set sail for England. As soon as he arrived, he hot-footed it to Sophia, proposed, they got engaged, and later on they got married. And then he embarked on his amazing career in Britain. Now, we don't have enough time really today to go through all the amazing stuff that he got up to. I mean, he was, as we've heard, the father of mass production, not just of pulley blocks, but later on boots for Wellington's army. He transformed the processing of timber in dockyards. He built steam engines, he built bridges. He was also, incidentally, a terrible businessman and ended up in debtor's prison. There was a huge amount going on there. So we'll just touch on probably Mark's two most famous projects. The first of all was the pulley blocks, for which he teamed up with this chap here, Henry Maudslay, which was a really smart move because Maudslay was arguably the foremost machine tool maker of the day. And between them, they built 45 different machines for making pulley blocks, which were arranged in production lines, installed in a factory in Portsmouth, opened in 1803. And it went on and on and on, this factory. Here it is in 1900, still going strong with all the machines there. And the blocks, well, in fact, it even went on into the 1960s before it finally, the last machine was put out of use. The blocks made by Mark's machines were used, for example, on some of the landing craft on D-Day in 1944. But Mark's best known project was, of course, the Thames Tunnel up in London, which had all the features of a classic Brunelian project. It had cutting edge technology, massively overspent, and of course, spectacularly late. It took something like 18 years to complete the Thames Tunnel. But when it finished, it was, of course, a wonder of the age. Initially, of course, for pedestrians, later on part of the London Underground, and it's still doing that today. Okay, let's move down a generation and we'll look at Mark and Sophia's children. Now, as well as Isambard here, they had two daughters, Sophia, another Sophia, and Emma. And there were two more children who both died in infancy. And we're not absolutely sure about the fourth one there, SB, but it's at least one, possibly two. So let's start with Sophia 2. Now, she was a remarkable young woman, very much in the Brunel mould, with an incredible grasp of engineering. In fact, she got this nickname of Brunel in petticoats. Now, sadly, in the early 1800s, it was virtually impossible for a woman to become an engineer. So she had to settle with becoming an artist. Here's a plate she decorated showing her daughter painting the Clifton Suspension Bridge. And if we look up closer here, this was done in 1840 when the bridge was far from complete. It's going to be another 24 years before it's finished. Now, Clifton Suspension Bridge nerds will note that the bridge shows the 1840 Brunel arrangement for the land chains. On the final bridge, the land chains are much, much steeper than this. Now, Sophia, she married Benjamin Hawes, was a keen supporter of a lot of Brunel's projects and very conveniently, the Under-Secretary of State for War. In 1855, Britain was knee-deep in the Crimean War, and following a report from Florence Nightingale, the British Army raised a requirement for a prefabricated hospital. It had to be built in Britain and shipped out to the Crimea to treat soldiers. Now, these days we're rather familiar with the allegations of cronyism in the awarding of government medical equipment contracts. And it was no different in the 1850s. Isambard Brunel, brother-in-law of Hawes, Under-Secretary for War, got the gig to build a hospital. And it was erected at Renkioi by the Dardanelles on the Turkish coast. We don't really have enough time to go into this in detail today. Perhaps we can do that on another day, but the project was a great success. It never really reached its full potential because the war ended before it had been built up to full capacity. Okay, turning to the second daughter, Emma Joan, she married George Harrison. Well, not this George Harrison, but a clergyman with the same name. And there's a lovely, tantalizing possibility of a connection between Emma and Isambard Brunel's box tunnel. Now, it's often said that the box tunnel was designed by Brunel so that the sun would shine straight through it on his birthday, which was the 9th of April. Sadly, this is not the case. However, the sun does shine straight through on 3 out of 4 leap years on the 6th of April, which happens to be Emma Joan Brunel's birthday. So it's a bit fanciful, but maybe, just maybe, the alignment of the box tunnel was a birthday present from Isambard to his sister, just maybe. Okay, we'll move on to Isambard Brunel's wife, Mary Horsley. Now, her father was this chap here, William Horsley, who was a musician and a composer. And you may not be familiar with him, but you might be familiar with something he wrote, which was the tune for the Easter hymn, "There is a Green Hill Far Away." Mary also had a couple of brothers, and one of them was this chap, John Calcott Horsley, who was an artist. He painted this rather famous picture of his brother-in-law, which you can see in the National Portrait Gallery. But he's better known for this, the world's first commercially produced Christmas card, which he designed for Henry Cole in 1843. Okay, we'll move on down to Isambard's children. 2 sons, another Isambard and Henry Mark Brunel, and 1 daughter, Florence Mary. Now, the 2 boys didn't produce any children, so all living descendants of Brunel come through Florence. But if we turn to the chaps, Isambard Brunel II, perhaps we'll call him, the son of Isambard Brunel I, he wasn't an engineer, he became a barrister, Chancellor of the Duchy of Ely. It is said that he was the first person to pass through Mark Brunel's Thames Tunnel, passed through on the age of around 6. He also wrote the first biography of his father in 1870. Isambard's second son, however, did become a successful engineer, not as great or as ambitious as his father and his grandfather, but nonetheless a pretty good engineer. He was initially apprenticed to William Armstrong, the arms manufacturer. Then he went on to spend some time working with John Hawkshaw, who of course, together with William Henry Barlow, was responsible for the completion of the Clifton Suspension Bridge after Isambard Brunel's death. Henry mainly worked on railway and dock projects, but he also got involved with Hawkshaw's work on a proposed Channel Tunnel in 1866. And Henry's job was to conduct an undersea survey of the cross-channel seabed. And this is generally reckoned to be the world's first undersea geological survey. Sadly, the tunnel project didn't go ahead. Henry then went on to partnership very successfully with John Wolfe Barry, and they worked on quite a few bridges, for example, the Blackfriars Railway Bridge, the Connell Cantilever Bridge up in Scotland. But the most famous bridge they worked on was this one, which I'm sure you will recognise, completed in 1894. However, my favourite of Henry's projects wasn't a bridge, but a ship. This thing here, the SS Chauncey Maples, a missionary steamship designed by Henry to operate on Lake Malawi in Africa, which was then called Lake Nyassa. The ship was prefabricated in Britain and sent out as a kit of 3,481 parts. And the idea was that they would be assembled by engineers on the banks of the lake. Unfortunately, after all the parts were very carefully numbered, so they would know how to put them together. But then after they were numbered, they galvanized them and all the numbers got hidden. You know, a 3D jigsaw puzzle without being able to see the picture on the box. However, it was a success. The thing was launched okay. It's spent an amazing life on the lake. It was a missionary school, a hospital ship. In the World War I, it was a gunboat and a troop carrier. And until recently, it was considered to be the oldest ship afloat in Africa. Sadly, it's in a bit of a state at the moment, and there's a project to try and restore it and make it into a mobile clinic. But when I last looked, they ran out of money, and so the whole project is a bit uncertain. Anyway, this is a picture of it in 2011. Okay, there you are. We've had a very whistle-top tour through Brunel's family. I hope you've enjoyed meeting the Brunels, and perhaps I've whetted your appetite to learn a bit more about this remarkable family.